Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 101st episode of the Writ podcast. There's been caucus revolts, ministerial resignations, leadership challenges, cabinet shuffles, threats of an election, and that's all just in New Brunswick. So to discuss the political drama in this province, I'm joined today by Jacques Poitras, the CBC's provincial affairs reporter in New Brunswick, and Michel LeBlanc of Radio-Canada Acadie. Hello to both of you. Thanks for being here.
Hello.
Thanks for the invitation.
So before we get into what's going to happen next, because I think that's really the biggest question, we kind of need a little bit of an explainer of how we got here. Jacques, maybe you can bring us through the Coles notes of the last few weeks in New Brunswick politics.
It's been an eternity, the last few weeks. It began, the first thing I'll say is a lot of the issues that have come to a head in the last few weeks have been simmering for some time, but they were brought to a head by the Higgs government's decision to review a policy that applies to provincial schools and LGBTQ plus students in those schools. And without going into the granular detail of the policy changes, which are, even the interpretation of them is sort of disputed and become a point of contention, the thrust of it is that some of these policies the protections were weakened or changed in a way that the community found or considered them to be weaker. And this set off an enormous political debate. There was clearly discomfort in caucus. There was a lot of pushback outside the legislature. But essentially what happened is the opposition Liberals introduced a motion which in its final amended form called on the government to slow down the review, essentially, rethink it, and consult the province's child and youth advocate, an arm's length officer of the legislature, on the changes, to do more consultations through him. What happened was that the motion was crafted in a way that it kind of mirrored what some progressive conservative government MLAs felt they had been promised by the Premier when this kind of uprising started. So first there was this extraordinary day where 6 of them didn't show up in the legislature that morning, weren't there for question period. I'm sorry, it was actually 8 that day. The numbers have changed quite a bit over time. So there were 8 who didn't show up. Well, this actually would have cost the government a vote on some legislation that was coming to a second reading vote that afternoon. So they did come back in time, but the commitment that was extracted supposedly to the caucus was that there would be more consultation. And then they felt that the Premier reneged on that, so they voted for this Liberal motion. 6 of them voted for this Liberal motion, 4 ministers and 2 backbenchers. It was kind of extraordinary to see. It was a non-binding motion in the sense that it didn't change any legislation, but nonetheless it was a vote against their own government. One of the ministers, Dorothy Shepherd, promptly quit immediately after the vote. Another minister resigned the following week, and then in a subsequent cabinet shuffle, the 2 other ministers who'd cast those votes were shuffled out. And so it's been nonstop drama. For this past week has really been the first week that things have quieted down, and just on the sort of granular, pedantic nature of that motion, while it wasn't binding on the government, on the executive branch, the child and youth advocate's an officer of the legislature, so he has taken that motion as binding on him because it passed 26-20. A majority of the legislature voted for it. So he's taken it as a directive from the legislature. So he is now conducting a further consultation and review, which will only serve to keep this issue alive for a few more weeks when his report comes back in August. So all in all, sort of a slap in the face to the Premier. And he responded with this cabinet shuffle where he got rid of all these unhappy people and brought in a bunch of people who all sort of very publicly affirmed their loyalty to him. So it's not really a capsule version, or it's a big capsule, but that is what happened. And maybe Michelle could remind me if I've missed anything.
I think it's pretty complete. Maybe just a word going back. Jacques mentioned that it was simmering for some time, and has been simmering for some time, because I think Blaine Higgs got elected with a majority government in 2021, and
20,
no one 20, yes, and no one thought he was going to stay the course so long. I think everyone was kind of expecting that he would leave eventually, so he kind of kept his caucus, and everyone in his caucus that maybe has aspiration to become the new leader of the PC party by leaving at some point, and he mainly already achieved his bigger promises, his signature promises, which was to bring the finance in New Brunswick in good order. We now have huge surpluses, but now he delved into the social issues, and that's where he gets some reaction within his own rank, as we can see.
And if I can just add one more thing that
I just wanted to say one little thing, because at a recent event a little while ago, Blaine Higgs is kind of playing with that, right? Because didn't they play the song "Should I Stay or Should I Go"?
Yes,
that's right.
Because I think a lot of people he made the point that he was going to say something about his future, and he made that's what he came up with, not answering anything, but seeming to stay the course for longer. Yeah.
Jacques, go ahead. You can finish.
Well, just the other thing I was going to add is, again, just to underscore the point that while this policy review has been the last straw, it's been very clear, especially from the two ministers who resigned, Dorothy Shepherd and Trevor Holder, their resignation statements and statements they made after, made it clear that their concern is with Higgs's leadership style in government overall, the way he runs cabinet, the way he runs caucus. Not listening to caucus, not listening to cabinet, they say, very top down, and very contrary to the kind of bedrock philosophy of the PC party, which is to push decision making out from the center towards ministers, MLAs, caucus, communities. And so they feel that he's gone against that core principle.
There's also it's not just within the caucus and the cabinet, right? There's now PC party riding association presidents who want to have a leadership challenge to Blaine Higgs. Jacques.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's really several tracks here going on at the same time. There's what happened in the legislature, which they reconvene in October, so there's some suspense about what's going to happen there. And then there's the leadership review, which is a party process, and we can go through the steps of what that process is, if you like. It's a steep hill to climb for the people who want to remove him. There's several steps to go through. It's deliberately difficult to remove a leader of the PC party of New Brunswick when they are in power. It's a lot easier to get to the leadership review vote when they've lost an election, but when they've won an election, it's a pretty onerous process. But that process is underway, and the first step, which is to get at least 20 of the 49 presidents of riding associations, has been accomplished, as well as some number of other members, and that requires it to then be put to a vote at the provincial council, which is the governing body of the party, and so that would be the next step. In fact, they have 26 riding presidents, so it's more than a majority of the 49 ridings, which is, politically significant.
But you have to have a two-third.
Yeah, go ahead.
And you have to have 2/3 of the voting of the provincial commission, so that's another step that has to be taken into account.
Well, as you saw with Jason Kenney in Alberta, even if you do pass these kinds of things, the fact that this is simmering underneath can still undermine your leadership. But Michelle, I wanted to ask you, because one of the cabinet ministers who was shuffled out was a bilingual cabinet minister, and there's not a lot of them in the PC caucus. They don't have a lot of support among Francophone New Brunswickers. What's the state of that right now? Because the polls suggest that the PC is still doing pretty good among Anglophones, but among Francophones, they seem to be in a lot of trouble.
They have been for some time. I think the last two elections, it was mostly Liberals that won the Acadian and Francophone ridings. in the cities, it has been a little bit more complex, a little bit more divided. But Daniel Alain, the minister, the ex-minister now that you were referring to, is Acadian. He's from Moncton, and he has a lot of sway among the party, among the most progressive members of the PC party. So that kind of muddy the situation a bit. And I think it's Blaine Higgs already made the point that he could win an election without any Francophone or almost any Francophone members. This is a situation that we will be looking at. Is he going to try to do the same thing? Or, as we saw, some other ministers that were who quit from St. John, Dorothy Shepherd, Trevor Holder, are not perceived as the most Francophone friendly ministers that we've had in New Brunswick. They're coming from ridings just next to the Blaine Higgs riding. So this kind of is creating a more complex situation. But of course, for the last years, ever since Blaine Higgs has been in power, the Francophone has not been acquired for the PC party, and there's no sign that it's going to be any better for Blaine Higgs, and he's not making any effort either to make friends with the Acadians, make friends with the Acadian community. He never learned to speak French. He tried to diminishes the power of the Official Languages Commissioner. So I think there's no coming back for Blaine Higgs, for the Acadian community, and his vote there is guaranteed to be non-existent.
And Jacques, is the leadership challenge at all related to this? Is it coming from Southern New Brunswick ridings, or is it coming from riding associations that are in the north that don't really have much of a chance of electing an MLA?
Well, you wouldn't get very far if you just had ridings in the north or Francophone ridings. And I think the people who are organizing this are conscious that it can't appear to be just a Francophone thing within the party, because that would cause even greater splits. But no, I mean, they've got 26 riding association presidents, and they're from all around the province. They're from cities and rural areas, north, south, English, French. So it is widespread. The dynamic in the leadership race, I think, and Michelle, I'll be interested to see if Michelle agrees, is what Higgs is really up against is the history of the party under Bernard Lord. He's juxtaposed against that legacy, because Lord was someone who really tried to build the party, bring everyone into the party, Anglophone and Francophone, North, South, was quite effective at it, was quite politically skilled, able to do that. But more than that, as I alluded to earlier, when Lord became Premier, there was a strong kind of reaction against what had been seen as a very centralizing approach to government under the Frank McKenna Liberals. And so his government really, they brought back elected school boards, which McKenna had eliminated. And now there's a live bill before the legislature that would reduce the powers of Anglophone school boards in the province. So again, this kind of runs counter to the DNA of all these people who kind of grew up in the PC party at the time that Lord was in power. And Jeff Carr, one of the ministers who was shuffled out, was his brother was in the government of Bernard Lord. Trevor Holder was first elected in the first Lord landslide. Danielle Alain is very close to Bernard Lord and the sort of the Moncton PC crowd. So that is, to me, that's the central dynamic in this leadership review. But as Michelle said, 2/3 on the provincial council is a very high hill to climb, and I think if it got to a convention, anything could happen. It would be wide open. But it's getting to that 2/3 vote to trigger the convention that I think is going to be the more difficult obstacle. A lot of the people on this provincial council are, there's the 49 riding presidents, but then there's also the campaign co-chairs, the fundraising chair. These are people who are tied to Higgs. So to get to 2/3 of the 70 odd people on that body, you kind of have to get almost all the riding presidents and maybe a couple more to get the 2/3, and I think that's going to be a challenge.
Okay, Jacques, you did mention there are 3 different kind of tracks. So I guess the first one would be just how this is going to work in the legislature, right? Whether Caucus is going to be sticking behind Higgs, whether the cabinet's going to align with him as well. What's going to happen to those people who were ousted. Michelle, maybe you can start, and Jacques, you can pick up after that. Just how do you expect these dynamics in the legislature to work for the next little while? Because there's not an election scheduled for another year.
No, I think the big question is what is going to happen to the ousted cabinet members. Are they going to stay in the caucus? Are they going to vote with the government? Because if they're not, it changes the dynamic and it changes the power, the balance of power in the legislature. The government could not pass the speech from the throne, would have a difficult time passing a budget unless it really is aligned with what the majority really wants. So this is what I will be looking at the most coming in the fall. What is going to happen to Daniel Alain, Trevor Holder, Dorothy Shepherd, Jeff Carr, because the government is not in a situation where it can lose that many members. You already have Dominic Cardy, who was the former education minister, who's independent, so it could make up for a lot of interesting times. And Blaine Higgs doesn't look like someone who really wants to make amends with these people anyway, not at this time. I don't know if Jacques you agree, but he's not handing any Oliver Branch anyway, not that I've heard of.
No, I mean he has made some comments about he knows he has to be part of the solution on this, and talking to party members this summer and trying to find a way through it. But on the other hand, he did drop these people from cabinet, which he really didn't have much of a choice to do. I mean, they did vote against a very contentious government policy move.
It's kind of convention that you have to vote. If you're in the cabinet, you're supposed to align with the government, even if you disagree with them, right?
I mean, there's been some discussion about what it wasn't really, it was a motion, it wasn't a bill, and all that. But in the end, it did become a defining policy initiative of the government. And so at that point, I think he didn't have much of a choice. The current cabinet, I mean, they're all happy to be there. And so I think they're rock solid. But, you've got the four ministers who either quit or were shuffled, and then you've got two backbenchers who were also vocally unhappy. Two of the ministers who cast those votes for that opposition motion have kind of fallen in line more or less and stayed in cabinet. But so you've got six. And in a 49-member legislature, the Conservatives have 29. So if those six did not vote with the government, they wouldn't be able to pass things, as Michelle said. They'd be down to 23 votes. Add Dominic Cardy, there's seven. If they voted with the opposition, they could wreak some real havoc. I don't know if they're the kind of people who want to blow the place up by voting against a throne speech or against a budget. But there is this bill that I mentioned that weakens the powers of the school boards, the Anglophone school boards. And that bill was supposed to come to a vote before the session adjourned in June, and it didn't. It was pulled, I think in part because of all this turmoil. And government, Higgs and the Minister of Education want to bring that bill back in the fall, and they want to go ahead with that. And that again, because it runs counter to this sort of PC DNA of the past 20 years, that I think will be one of the sticking points where we will see what these six members will do and how much trouble they want to cause.
If we can move then, we've already talked about the process for the leadership review, but over and above the actual review itself, Higgs has now been leader of the party for quite a while, and he's not doing terrifically in the polls. If he does win another election, you would imagine, a lot of people imagined it after 2020, but you would imagine that would be the last election for Blaine Higgs, even if he was able to win it. So I'd like to hear from both of you. Who, Jacques, you can maybe start. Who would replace Higgs?
Well, I don't think there's any question that Daniel Alain is interested in the position and is seen by many as the one of the heir apparents. Not necessarily that Higgs would want. He has made remarks in a couple of interviews recently about, in effect, saying that he wasn't yet convinced there was anyone who would keep his policies in place, which I think was actually quite a provocative comment for him to make. But Daniel Alain would represent that part of the party, that sort of Bernard Lord school of thought. And then I think we'd probably have a candidate from either Fredericton or St. John There's talk of Jody Carr, brother of one of the shuffled ministers, coming back, or of Jeff Carr running himself. There's some St. John names. But the St. John and Fredericton parts of the party always kind of get their noses out of joint when Moncton is a bit too much in the spotlight. So you could have a situation where there'd be a candidate from that part of the province and a leading candidate from Moncton, who may kind of share the point of view that it's time to move on from Blaine Higgs, but might create an interesting race within the party.
Michelle?
I think that we can't expect Chris Austin, who's the former leader of the People's Alliance in New Brunswick, who joined the PC government under Blaine Higgs, maybe to try his chance as a PC of the leader of the PC. And I think that Blaine Higgs, and I asked him the question, would he see in Chris Austin a viable leader for the PC party? And I think they're more aligned on social values anyway than any other that were mentioned by Jacques. But Chris Austin would never get elected in any French riding, I think. But then again, Blaine Higgs made the point that it can be done in New Brunswick to be elected premier without having one single Francophone riding.
The People's Alliance seemed to be heading to the dustbin of history, but then it was reinvigorated or at least reestablished. What role does it play here, Jacques? Are they a factor? Are they pulling Higgs in a way that is causing trouble with the rest of the caucus?
I don't think the fact that the party still exists is much of a factor. We haven't heard from them. They haven't come out and said anything about any of this. They did speak out briefly when Higgs wanted to replace French immersion. They actually came out against it and said it should be kept. But on this, they've been totally silent. So I don't think they're much of a factor. I think what's more of a factor in this current situation is Chris Austin moving into the PC party, becoming part of cabinet, and kind of solidifying or adding to that kind of point of view, that perspective in the caucus, which may be a factor in that has contributed to Higgs sort of starting to move in that direction in some of his policies and being less kind of cautious and pragmatic as he was back when he had a minority government.
And do either of you think that this could lead to any sort of split or division within the party?
I don't think so, because I think everyone knows what a disaster that would be electorally, but it is easy to imagine how polarized the party could become. Because if, for example, Chris Austin did manage to win the leadership in the future, you'd have even more of a defection of Francophone support from the party. And conversely, I think if Danielle Alain won, there would be some in the party who maybe were former Alliance people or so inclined, who would see him as sort of like usurping Higgs's role or something like that. So there's a basis for some very, I think, bad feelings within the party, no matter how this goes.
Michelle, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Well, I think one thing to watch is, and we alluded to that earlier, is when we're talking about the upcoming session, if there was to be a confidence vote, if we were to go into election, all the ousted members of the cabinet said that they would not reoffer under Higgs. And there's quite a questioning whether Higgs would even sign their papers to be candidate. So that would bring a different situation where the party would probably select people who are leaning more on the right side, and that would create a situation that we haven't seen in New Brunswick in quite some time. During the Lord years, there has been this big reconcile within the party with French Anglophone and different people from all across New Brunswick. So this would be very interesting, and I think the next polls are going to be interesting because it will probably dictate some of the actions of these rogue members for now, to see how they will react, because the PC party is still doing pretty good in the polling, but with the situation that erupted in the last month, I think it can change, and people don't like to see a party disputing within. And it doesn't necessarily bring confidence. So these are some of the things that can change a lot of things for the PC party.
And if some of those members on the outs were actually not allowed to run, then that in turn would have an impact on the morale of their local party organizations. That party members who've been behind them in some cases for decades may sit it out too. And then you're getting into some ridings that are kind of reliable PC seats or swing seats, and you've all of a sudden got a very demoralized party volunteer base at campaign time. So there's all kinds of risks in all kinds of directions here.
And I think it's not a surprise that you see that the opposition parties are very silent. The Liberals, you don't hear them anywhere. The Greens, same thing. But I think they let all the the dispute in the PC party do its work for themselves.
Yeah, there's a famous.
I think we have probably the same thing,
Napoleon
right?
one, yeah.
Yeah, don't interrupt your opponent when they're making a mistake or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
And the last poll that we saw was before all of this, and it was from Narrative Research, and they had a tie between the PCs and the Liberals, but a tie is probably a majority for the PCs just because of how the electoral geography breaks down. So that brings us to the last bit, which is the election. Jacques, how likely is it that the election happens on schedule in the fall of 2024?
Well, I think if those PCMLAs don't blow things up this fall, then I think we won't have an election this fall. But I think it is within the realm of possibility. And I also think if the leadership review, if the leadership review were to sort of gather steam, that might motivate Higgs to call an election sooner. Conversely, if it kind of looks like it's not going to get over that 2/3 hurdle, then he might be safe, because otherwise he's got a cabinet now that is on side, and he's got 4 months now to do whatever and maybe try to smooth things over. So there's no rush for him to call an election. There's one element of the next election, though, that is right in your wheelhouse, Eric. If you want to get into that, it's sort of a side drama to all this, but I should just mention that just yesterday, the new riding map was adopted, which redraws the 49 ridings in their electoral boundaries. So that's interesting in itself for people like us. But the other potential impact of that in the leadership review process is that by fall, all these riding associations will have to be dissolved and then reconstituted along with memberships following the new boundaries and new riding presidents elected. So what happens to all these 26 letters that have been signed if they are suddenly invalidated? If the party president rules that all of this is now has now expired, then you get into kind of a nasty interpretation of the rules fight within the party, and that'll just add another layer of drama to this, because sometime this fall those 26 riding presidents will not be presidents of anything anymore.
And Jacques, just so I can take off the tinfoil hat, was this just coincidence in terms of the timing?
Well, the timeline for redrawing the maps is legislated, and it's every 10 years. So it did sort of line up, but I think it is generally a coincidence. But I'm certain that someone, a political staffer close to the premier, must delight in this wrench being thrown into the works.
Michelle, what would be your assessment of, first of all, whether the PCs would even want to have an early election, but how the opposition parties are feeling about all this and their chances in the next campaign?
Well, I think they're lying low for a reason, and it's probably good for them. I know that the polls are your thing, but I'm not sure. I'm always curious to see. I'm not sure Higgs wouldn't have. Well, I think with the situation, he would have definitely a more difficult time winning a majority election, not just because of the French riding, but I think people in the cities in New Brunswick, Moncton, Fredericton, St. John's are getting questions about his leadership, and I think all that we've saw maybe resonate more in cities than it does in rural regions. And if you have already all the rural regions in the French New Brunswick, voting against Higgs, and then a few in the cities. That makes him he has a difficult path to follow to win a majority election. And as for the opposition parties, I think that the Liberals, well, they're under a new leadership with Susan Holt. They're kind of looking good at this point. She has not made any big mistakes so far. She got into the legislature in the last month, so it's going to be interesting. I think that the Higgs government, before all this, already had some fatigue, and the Liberals will likely win some of this fatigue vote on their side.
And in the by-elections that took place just a little while ago, the Liberals' vote held up pretty well, and the PC vote didn't do so well. And in one of them, it was a Moncton riding that wasn't a good riding necessarily for the PCs, but it's still in the city, and it was a kind of a drop that they couldn't afford in the rest of Moncton.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. If you take that vote in Dieppe and extrapolate it to like francophones elsewhere in Moncton, some of these other Moncton ridings, even the ones that are like 20% francophone, if that goes to the Liberals at the same rate as it did in that by-election in Dieppe, some of those PC MLAs have a hard time catching up. And when Higgs was re-elected in 2020 with his majority, I think a lot of that vote was about competence, about his handling of COVID. I mean, things were going really well with COVID at the time. We were having a great first pandemic summer, and I think he was rewarded for being a steady hand. And so I would say some of those voters would probably wonder about the steady hand argument now, given what's going on. But I think there's also a challenge for the Liberals, right? Because the Liberals, there's some, as Michelle said, especially I would say in Fredericton, Moncton, St. John, there's sort of a middle center ground politically that is up for grabs, I would say, with what's been going on with the government. Those would be a lot of those people who voted for Higgs based on COVID. But the Liberals have to kind of find a way to occupy that space. And the Tories have been going after Susan Holt a bit. It's been sort of gearing up, sort of the like too left wing, too green, too woke kind of language. And she's also got the challenge of that 15% or so that votes for the Green Party, that is consistently strong for the Green Party. And she wants some of that vote, but she also wants some of that middle vote. And how do the Liberals kind of occupy the broad center and also kind of deal with this drag on their vote from the Green Party? So it's not a cakewalk for Susan Holt either.
Yeah, there'll be a lot to discuss ahead of the next election, whenever that might be. Though if you were making bets on what's going to happen in New Brunswick politics over the last couple of months, I think you lost some money. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to suggest when the election is going to be taking place. But
I always apply the Paul Wells first rule, which is that Canadian politics tend to the least exciting outcome, and I've already been proven wrong on that in the last month. So I wouldn't want to bet on calm and serenity anytime soon.
All right. Well, we'll see if we have to gather again to chat about the next chapter in this drama. So, Michelle and Jacques, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.